Welcome to the Exclusion Zone. Here are some basic facts about the Chernobyl disaster.
The accident occurred on April 26, 1986 at the number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, then located in the Ukrainian SSR, and now in Ukraine's Kiev Oblast. It was the worst nuclear disaster in history, and one of only 2 nuclear energy accidents rated at 7, the maximum severity on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The explosion and fire released large amounts of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, which spread over much of western USSR and Europe. The accident caused a significant number of deaths and illnesses, as well as long-lasting environmental damage. The city of Pripyat and nearby villages were evacuated and never reoccupied. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, covering an area of 2,600 square kilometers in Ukraine and Belarus, was established to limit further exposure and health risks to the public. The other nuclear accident rated at 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in Japan. That disaster occurred on March 11, 2011, and was caused by a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and subsequent tsunami striking Fukushima Prefecture. This resulted in multiple meltdowns and hydrogen air explosions at the power plant, releasing large amounts of radioactive materials into the environment. The Chernobyl disaster did not directly lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which took place several years later in 1991. However, it was one of several factors contributing to a general decline in the popularity and legitimacy of the ruling Communist Party. The government's handling of the disaster, including the initial cover-up and evacuation of over 100,000 people, revealed shortcomings in the Soviet system, particularly with regards to transparency and accountability. The disaster also had a significant economic impact, as extensive swaths of agricultural and industrial land were contaminated. The costs associated with cleanup and compensation for victims added further strain to an already struggling economy. Therefore, the disaster was seen by many as symbolic of the broader problems facing the Soviet Union. It vastly contributed to the growing sense of disillusionment with the government and the Communist Party. Effects of the Chernobyl disaster include widespread contamination of land and increased rates of cancer and other health problems. There is also a long-lasting environmental impact, contamination of soil, water, and vegetation, and economic decline in contaminated areas. Not to mention the mental health impact on those directly affected, such as evacuees and emergency responders. The disaster continues to have far-reaching and long-lasting effects, and its impact is still being felt today. Did you know that those affected by the Chernobyl disaster received a dose of radiation similar to survivors of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945? The average dose of radiation received was 45 rem, not enough to cause radiation sickness, but enough to increase the risk of cancer. Around 30,000 people were directly affected by the explosion of reactor number 4. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the cumulative radiation dosage generated by the Chernobyl disaster amounted to 10 million rem. 100 to 200 rem will cause mild radiation sickness, resulting in symptoms such as nausea, diarrhea, and fatigue. 3 to 400 rem means a 50% chance of death within the next 2 months if left untreated. Exposure exceeding 400 rem means almost certain death within months, weeks, or in cases of extremely high doses, days. 32 people are confirmed to have died as a direct result of the disaster. The exact number of people who suffered long-term consequences is still an open question in scientific circles. Current radiation levels in the exclusion zone are quite low considering the scope of the catastrophe. Nevertheless, there are places and objects here that constitute a genuine health risk, known as radioactive hotspots. Typically, cracks can be found in various locations around the zone where radionuclides such as cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-241 have accumulated. Also, the equipment used to deal with the Chernobyl disaster, now abandoned and heavily irradiated. If you stayed in one of the hotspots for a long time, you could develop radiation sickness. But you don't want to test this theory in real life, trust me. Scientists estimate it will take 3,000 years for the exclusion zone to be free of radiation. As for the NPP, it may take up to 20,000 years. This metal monstrosity has many names. Duga radar, Russian woodpecker, Moscow eye. It's an over-the-horizon radar. Once part of the Soviet Union's early warning missile defense network, it was designed to detect an incoming nuclear strike from the west. The facility was operational from July 1976 to December 1989. The Duga complex was closed in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster due to the threat of radiation. Later on, much of the technology was stripped and moved to Moscow. The less important components were looted. The name referred to the radar's distinct sound on shortwave radios, which sounded like tapping. Shortwave radio hobbyists dubbed it woodpecker. Duga interfered with civilian radio frequencies even abroad. At one point, an amateur Russian woodpecker hunting club was formed in Texas to jam the signal. Even today, wild theories surround Duga radar, including speculation that it was used for weather control, psyops, and brainwashing. The official documents about Duga have never been released, leaving the field wide open for conspiracy theories and urban legends, none of which are backed by evidence. The antenna alone is 700 meters long and 150 meters tall. The Duga complex had its own air defense system, military hospital, and technical buildings. To confuse the enemy during the Cold War, the complex was marked as a children's camp on official maps. A bus stop was also built nearby to confuse foreign spies. Before you stands the monument to those who saved the world. This intricate sculpture commemorates the many heroic firefighters who died from radiation exposure in the aftermath of the explosion of reactor number 4 of Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The monument's grand reveal took place on the April 16, 1996, marking the 10th anniversary of the catastrophe. Some researchers claim the firemen received 5,600 years worth of the maximum safe dose of radiation within 48 seconds. Dozens of them died over the following weeks. The authorities downplayed the risks to avoid creating a panic. The fire brigade had no radiation suits, no oxygen masks, no proper equipment. At Matino Cemetery in Moscow, since their bodies were highly radioactive, the authorities had them buried in zinc coffins. Gamma radiation is produced from the decay of radioactive isotopes of plutonium and uranium, elements used as fuel in a nuclear reactor. Did you know that following the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet military conducted a large-scale culling of domestic and wild animals in the affected areas? This was necessary to prevent the spread of contamination, but it had a significant impact on the local ecosystem and wildlife populations. The exact number of animals killed during the culling is unknown, but it is estimated to be in the tens of thousands. This included domesticated animals such as cows, pigs, and horses, as well as wild animals like deer, boars, and wolves. Sadly, yes, the only option was to reduce the risk of radioactive contamination of the food supply. Minimizing the exposure of humans and other animals to radioactive materials was also an important goal. Some dogs and cats escaped into the woods in 1986. Their descendants are still living in the zone today, despite the radiation. Volunteers and welfare organizations feed and monitor them. Did you know aircraft were used not only to assist in the liquidation of the disaster site, but also for cloud seeding? The military was tasked with cloud seeding to prevent radioactive fallout from reaching Moscow and other major Soviet cities. Cloud seeding is a process of introducing materials into clouds to generate rain or snowfall. Cloud seeding increases precipitation in specific areas by adding particles with additional nuclei around which water can condense. The most common method of cloud seeding involves dropping chemicals, such as silver iodide, into clouds from an aircraft. 216 pilots undertook risky flights near the still-burning power plant, firing silver iodide-filled projectiles into the radioactive clouds within a 10-kilometer radius of Chernobyl. They then chased the dangerous clouds away, up to 100 kilometers, into the skies over Belarusian cities like Mogilev, Norulia, Gomel, Koiniki, and Brehin. From May to December 1986, planes made repeated flights around Chernobyl in an 80-kilometer loop, dispersing Cement 600, a mixture of cement and special agents. This caused a 5-month drought in Ukraine, as the Cement 600 absorbed moisture from clouds, preventing precipitation.
Welcome to the Red Forest, a famous tract of woodlands located in the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
The forest earned its name due to the red color of the pine trees that succumbed to intense radiation following the nuclear accident in 1986. The Red Forest is still considered one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Its trees had to be buried to prevent the further spread of radioactive contamination. The forest's soil, water, and air are also irradiated. Fortunately, despite the contamination, the Red Forest has become a unique habitat for a variety of wildlife, including deer, wild boar, and wolves. Scientists have also observed mutations in the local plants and animals, including genetic abnormalities and changes in physical characteristics. Stalker is a term used to describe individuals who venture into the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl disaster site. They do so for various reasons, such as taking photographs and collecting information, or simply for the thrill of exploring a forbidden and abandoned place. Despite the danger posed by radiation, many people still visit the exclusion zone and engage in these activities. Remember that entering the exclusion zone without proper protective gear and authorization is illegal and can be highly dangerous to one's health. The name derives from the 1979 science fiction novel and subsequent movie Roadside Picnic by Russian authors Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. In the book, the term stalker refers to individuals who venture into a restricted zone created by aliens to scavenge valuable artifacts. The term Chernobyl stalkers is an analogy describing individuals scavenging for valuables or exploring within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Estimates vary widely, but some sources suggest that a few thousand people visit the exclusion zone each year. The majority are tourists seeking to explore the abandoned city of Pripyat and the surrounding area. However, these numbers are difficult to verify, as many visitors enter the zone illegally and without proper authorization. What you see here is the Claw, a large metal structure located in the Red Forest area of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This equipment was used in cleanup and containment efforts following the Chernobyl disaster. Despite its notoriety, the Claw acts as a reminder of the ongoing risks posed by the disaster and continuing efforts to address its legacy. It was used to remove radioactive graphite emitting 20,000 roentgen per hour from the roof of reactor number 3. It's still dangerous even today. It's one of the few remaining physical reminders of the scale and scope of the cleanup operation, involving thousands of workers and specialized equipment. The Claw has become a symbol of the Chernobyl disaster and a popular destination for photographers and tourists visiting the exclusion zone. It depends on several factors, including the type and level of radiation, the duration of exposure, and the sensitivity of the individual. However, a dose of about 10 sieverts is considered lethal for the majority of the population. It is important to note that lower doses of radiation can have serious health effects, depending on the exposure conditions. Behold Pripyat's river port. This was once an important transportation and communication hub for the city. The Pripyat River is a tributary of the Dnieper River in northern Ukraine. It's 724 kilometers long and has a catchment area of 97,000 square kilometers. The river flows through the exclusion zone of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Before the accident, it was used to transport goods and materials to and from the power plant. The river and its tributaries were heavily contaminated in the aftermath of the disaster. Its water was also used to cool the damaged reactors. The Pripyat River is home to a variety of fish, including catfish, bream, perch, pike, and roach. But fishing in the river and its tributaries is prohibited. This is Pripyat Hospital 126. It used to be one of several medical facilities serving Pripyat and the neighboring areas. It was operational during the time of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. The hospital was used to treat and evacuate the injured workers and nearby residents, but eventually became contaminated with radioactive materials. Today, the hospital is abandoned and serves as a reminder of the devastating effects of the Chernobyl disaster. On the night of the Chernobyl disaster, firemen and plant workers were taken to Pripyat Hospital 126 with radiation sickness and burns. They arrived still wearing their contaminated suits and were treated at the hospital. Despite being abandoned for over 30 years, their suits stored in the basement still emit dangerous levels of radiation. Pripyat Hospital 126 had 410 beds and several clinics in 5 interconnected, 6-story buildings. It was located on Druzhby-Narodov Street, near the cafe and dock, and took up most of Microdistrict 1 in Pripyat. A large sign on the roof read, "The health of the people is the wealth of the country." Did you know that Pripyat was supposed to be an Atomgrad, the Soviet city of the future powered by atomic energy, built for the elite engineers and artists? Atomograds or Atomgrads were small industrial cities designed to serve the needs of commercial nuclear power plants. With populations ranging from 30,000 to 80,000, these cities emerged in the 1960s and 70s, mainly in the western parts of the Soviet Union. Almost all of them were located within agricultural landscapes and close to rivers, which Soviet engineers deemed suitable for building nuclear power plants. These sites were not situated far from industrial regions that required electric power, yet they had low population densities. Unlike secret, restricted nuclear facilities, Atomograds served the dual purpose of energy economy and political propaganda, and were public projects. The residents of Atomograds were well educated and socially privileged compared to the average city dweller in the Soviet Union. These cities played a crucial propaganda role and represented a particular type and stage of socialist industrial city planning and social engineering. The most notable were the Chelyabinsk 40, now Ozersk, Sverdlovsk 44, now Zerchny, Krasnoyarsk 26, now Zheleznogorsk, and Tomsk 7, now Seversk. Nuclear cities heavily influenced their surroundings and provided opportunities for young people to escape the farm and learn about modern urban and industrial life. However, not everyone benefited equally in this nuclear utopia, as social stratification along linguistic and educational lines was common. This led to conflicts regarding wages, privileges, and access to housing. The Soviet atomic cities were considered a success in that they produced the fissile material necessary for the development and production of nuclear weapons. But the cost in health and safety of the workers and the local population, as well as the environmental impact, was significant. Additionally, the secrecy surrounding these cities created widespread distrust and concern. Statues of Lenin symbolize the ideology of communism and the leadership of the Soviet Union under Lenin and later under Joseph Stalin. They were often prominently placed in public spaces like town squares, parks, and on top of buildings. They were a reminder of the state's power and its officially mandated ideology. The statues were a form of political propaganda used to promote the ideals and values of the Communist Party and to maintain public support for the government. Soviet propaganda regarding the Chernobyl disaster portrayed the event as a minor accident caused by operator error. The official response downplayed the number of casualties and emphasized the Soviet state's quick response to the disaster. The goal was to minimize public panic and maintain trust in the government and the nuclear energy industry. The true scale of the disaster and its long-term impacts were suppressed and only became widely known after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The initial response from the Soviet government was to downplay the severity of the accident and conceal information about the disaster from the public. In fact, the authorities initially denied that any radioactive material had been released and claimed that only 2 people had died. Only after significant radioactive fallout was detected in nearby countries did the Soviet government admit that a major accident had taken place. The true scale of the disaster was suppressed for many years. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did more accurate information become widely known. To this day, there are those who refuse to believe Chernobyl was simply an accident. Some believe it was a Western plot to undermine the Soviet Union, or a failed experiment in military technology, or that extraterrestrial beings were involved. But the causes of the disaster have since been thoroughly investigated and widely documented. The consensus among experts is that the disaster was the result of a combination of design flaws in the reactor and operator error. Cafe Pripyat never reopened after the disaster at Chernobyl NPP. It remains abandoned and is now a popular tourist destination in Pripyat. This place is really one of a kind. It offers a unique and eerie glimpse into the past. It was a place of leisure and recreation in a youthful, forward-thinking community. Inside the cafe, ornate stained glass windows added a touch of elegance which was vastly different from the city's uniform architecture. It was known as the Dish and was a popular lakeshore hangout for young people in Pripyat. It was a hub of activity in the summer and hosted regular picnics and barbecues. In the winter, families would go ice skating on the frozen lake. On April 26, the government commission in Pripyat discussed using helicopters to scatter sand over the damaged reactor. This sand was gathered from near Cafe Pripyat. 150 young men with shovels, along with a truck filled with empty sacks, were dispatched for the operation. They worked tirelessly through the night, filling one sack after another until they were allowed to go home and rest. The Emerald Camp was established prior to the Chernobyl disaster and was used by the families of military personnel working at the nearby Duga 2 radar facility. It served as a summer camp for children, providing them with a chance to spend time in a forested, rural environment and participate in recreational activities. The camp continued to operate after the disaster, but the surrounding area was eventually designated as part of the exclusion zone due to high levels of radiation. Unfortunately, it was mostly destroyed by forest fires in 2020. What you see is a virtual reconstruction of the original. The Young Pioneers were a massive Soviet youth organization for children aged 9–14. It was founded in 1922 and was modeled after the Scouts. The aim of the organization was to educate and politically indoctrinate young people in Marxist-Leninist ideology and to promote Soviet patriotism. The Young Pioneers offered young people opportunities for physical, cultural, and social development, encompassing activities such as camping, sports, and arts and crafts. They also participated in political and social events and various ceremonies and parades. Membership was seen as a rite of passage for young people. The organization was dissolved in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Kapachi Kindergarten is one of the last buildings standing in the village. It was abandoned and remains in a state of disrepair, but is still a popular tourist spot. Most other buildings in the area have been demolished and the ruins buried due to high radioactivity. You can read on the tin plate on the facade that it was built in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Great October Revolution in 1967. Typical preschool curriculum of the era emphasized the development of social skills and physical coordination. The basics of language, mathematics, and natural science were also taught. The curriculum was designed to prepare children for primary school and to instill a love of learning and a sense of civic responsibility. Unsurprisingly, it also aimed to promote Marxist ideology and values such as collectivism and equality. Yes, iodine-131 is especially dangerous for kids. Young thyroids absorb this radioisotope very quickly. Overall, children's cells divide more rapidly than adult cells, increasing the risk of cell damage from radiation exposure. Additionally, children's organs, bones, and tissues are still developing, which also makes them more vulnerable to the effects of radiation. This is only one of many monuments in the exclusion zone commemorating World War II soldiers. However, it is probably the most visited by tourists today. The inscription below reads, "Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in the battles for the freedom and independence of our homeland." The names of Kapachi residents who died in combat in World War II, as well as those soldiers who died during the liberation of Kapachi in 1943. Welcome to Kapachi, a village located near the city of Pripyat and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Kapachi was heavily contaminated by radioactive fallout and was evacuated and abandoned shortly after the accident. Kapachi is located about 5 kilometers southwest of the Chernobyl nuclear power station. It's one of the closest settlements to the plant. The area around the village is considered to be a dead zone and not safe for human habitation. Probably around 500 people. Like many other villages in the area, it was a small, rural community made up mostly of farmers and their families. Before the disaster, Kapachi had a typical layout for a small village, featuring several residences, farmsteads, and small administrative buildings. After the accident, the government demolished many of Kapachi's buildings in hopes of reducing the spread of contamination. Did you know that during the cleanup, residential homes were literally buried? The top layer of contaminated soil was removed, surfaces were treated with special decontaminating solutions, and radioactive materials were buried. Cleanup also involved the demolition and disposal of heavily contaminated residential buildings in many villages in the exclusion zone. Approximately 115,000 people were resettled as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. It was necessary to protect people from harmful radiation, and the residents of several contaminated towns and villages were moved to safer areas. The evacuation and resettlement process was carried out by the Soviet government. It had a profound impact on the lives of those affected, and many struggled to adjust to their new circumstances. Despite the challenges, the resettlement was seen as a necessary measure to protect public health and limit the spread of radioactive contamination. Some individuals eventually returned to their homes inside the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. These individuals are known as self-settlers or samoseals. They are easily distinguished by their well-kept homes that stand out from the overgrown and dilapidated houses around them. As of 2016, approximately 180 people lived in the exclusion zone, with 80 of them residing in Chernobyl and 100 in nearby villages. Interestingly, most of the families who returned to the exclusion zone did so in the first year after the disaster. Today, they are mostly elderly and unable to relocate elsewhere. The exclusion zone is also home to approximately 3,000 workers who live on site part-time to provide security, rescue services, and administrative support. The self-settlers are not concerned about radiation levels, and they don't mind the increasing number of tourists visiting the ghost town. They have lived in harmony with nature for a long time and do not complain, despite their isolation from the rest of society. Did you know that more than 600,000 people were involved in the liquidation effort in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster? An extensive cleanup operation was carried out to control the release of radioactive materials and contain the spread of radioactive contamination. The effort involved hundreds of thousands of workers, referred to as liquidators, who cleaned up the area around the damaged reactor. They also built a sarcophagus around the reactor to contain the remaining radioactive materials. Removing debris and radioactive material, this involved cleaning up the area around the damaged reactor and decontaminating buildings, roads, and other structures. The liquidators were also involved in the construction of a massive concrete sarcophagus designed to contain the remaining radioactive materials. They worked to decontaminate the evacuated areas around the power plant and to make them safe for resettlement. During a later stage, liquidators decommissioned the damaged reactor, including the removal of damaged fuel rods and the sealing of the reactor core. They continued to be involved in monitoring and maintaining the containment of radioactive materials at the site. This included the sarcophagus and the spent fuel storage facilities. The liquidators also assisted in the evacuation of over 100,000 people from the surrounding area and the relocation of affected populations. The over 600,000 liquidators faced significant health risks due to exposure to high levels of radiation. Many of them have since suffered from a range of health problems, including increased rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other illnesses. In addition, many have also reported mental health problems, such as anxiety and depression. The government of the Soviet Union provided some compensation and medical support to the liquidators. However, the exact extent of the health impacts and the number of deaths related to the disaster is still unclear. The Chernobyl disaster's impact on the health of the liquidators continues to be a source of concern and the subject of ongoing study. The Policia Hotel was built in the 1970s to accommodate party officials and guests visiting the nuclear power plant. After the Chernobyl disaster, Pripyat was evacuated and the hotel abandoned. Today, the Policia Hotel is one of many abandoned structures in the exclusion zone and a popular destination for tourists exploring this ghost town. The hotel was used as headquarters for the liquidators and their operations. Spotters used the roof to coordinate helicopters dumping sand and boric acid and directed machines into the exposed reactor core. Rumor has it that Gorbachev stayed at the hotel once when he came to check on the progress of the liquidation. The hotel is located on Lenin Square and used to be part of a complex that included the hotel, the Palace of Culture Energetic, a department store, and a diner. There were also plans for a cafe on the top floor of the hotel, but it never opened. The Policia is where Valery Legasov, a scientist renowned for his portrayal in the HBO series, stayed during his first days on site after the Chernobyl disaster. The Palace of Culture Energetic was the cultural center of Pripyat. It was built in the 1970s and is one of the largest structures in the city. It was a locus of cultural, educational, and sporting events. After the Chernobyl disaster, the building was abandoned along with the rest of the city, but its ruin remains there to this day.
Energetic was a play on words referencing both the power plant worker and the positive energy of the Pripyat community.
In 1988, the Soviet Union had over 137,000 palaces of culture. They were large community centers established during the Soviet era. The Palace of Culture Energetic hosted discos every weekend. These events were named Edison II after the electronic music equipment. They were very popular among the residents of Pripyat. After the disaster, the Energetic was used as a technical building for the liquidators. The amusement park was planned to be a recreational spot for residents of the city and surrounding areas. It was intended as a fun place for children and families and featured a number of attractions, including a Ferris wheel, swings, and a carousel. However, due to radioactive contamination following the disaster, the park was never opened to the public and remained abandoned for years. Some of its attractions are still standing, though they are severely deteriorated and contaminated with radioactive materials. Ironically, the grand opening was supposed to take place on May 1st, just days after the disaster. Some claim the park was partially opened for a couple of hours before that day to distract the citizens of Pripyat from the accident at the power plant. There were at least 2 illegal attempts by stalkers to revive the Ferris wheel. In response, Ukrainian authorities welded various metal components of the Ferris wheel together, so it could not be powered up again. It was a serious safety concern. Hopefully no one will try something so reckless again. The Ferris wheel is an abandoned amusement park ride located in the heart of the ghost town of Pripyat. It is also an iconic symbol of the city. It's a popular tourist attraction. Along with other rides, it remains in its original location, overgrown with vegetation and slowly turning to rust. The Ferris wheel was never used, as the disaster occurred just days before the city was set to officially open the amusement park. The grand opening was scheduled to take place on May 1st, 1986. It's 24 meters tall and would complete a full rotation in 5 minutes. It was intended as entertainment for children and to provide a view of the city. The amusement park grounds served as a landing pad for helicopters taking part in the liquidation. The machines were routinely cleaned and the radionuclides washed into the soil. While areas covered in concrete are relatively safe, radiation levels in places where moss is growing reach up to 25,000 microsievert per hour, some of the highest in all of Pripyat. You are now in a typical flat of a nuclear power plant worker. In just these few dozen square meters, a family lived their lives. In the 80s, this flat was considered very comfortable and indicated high social status. Most of the flats in Pripyat are empty. Chairs, sofas, and other furnishings remain in only a few of them. When it became clear that Pripyat would remain a ghost town forever, several trips were organized, during which residents could retrieve their most valuable items from their flats. Later on, whatever was left was thrown through the windows and then buried in designated spots. This was to discourage people from ever returning home again. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water, because it had been made bitter. This is a quote from the Bible, Revelation 8:10-12. The angel in the book of Revelations predicted that the arrival of a giant star called Wormwood would bring about doomsday. Interestingly, the plant known as wormwood, Latin name, Artemisia absinthium, is related to common mugwort, commonly known as black mugwort. In a free translation, Chernobyl means black wormwood. It's also the name of the town that housed the power plant. An ominous coincidence, isn't it? The Azure Swimming Pool is an iconic indoor pool located at 18 Sportivnia Street in Pripyat's 3rd microdistrict. The pool was built in the 1970s and remained open until 12 years after the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. During that time, the pool was primarily used by the liquidators. In spite of the disaster, the pool was one of the best maintained places in Pripyat. Since its closing in 1998, the pool and the nearby indoor basketball court have been left to deteriorate and are now abandoned. Before the accident at the power plant, Pripyat was a rapidly growing city. The Soviet government placed a strong emphasis on sports and physical fitness. As a result, many sports complexes, clubs, and swimming pools were constructed. One of the most notable was the Azure Indoor Sports Complex. It featured a pool with 5 swimming lanes and 2 diving platforms, as well as a gym and basketball court. It was opened in 1970 and regularly hosted swimming competitions. It was located in a relatively safe area and was used by employees of the Exclusion Zone Administration and liquidators. The pool was closed in 1998 due to the shutdown of the 3rd reactor, which meant hot water was no longer supplied to the city. Today, like every other structure in the exclusion zone, it is abandoned. The clock above the pool still displays the approximate time of the accident. Electricity and water were cut off to most buildings in the city, but were later restored in facilities where government officials were working, including Lazarny. On one of the walls, the word "rain" is written in graffiti. Indoctrination was a crucial element of education in the Soviet system. From a young age, children were taught about the forefathers of communism, the leading role of the party, and the foundations of socialist society. Teachers instilled the values of total submission of the individual and the collectivization of action. Such classes were ubiquitous in every republic of the Soviet Union, as well as Eastern Bloc countries like East Germany and Poland. Music lessons played an important role in youth education. Talented children were enrolled in school bands and choirs, which took part in national competitions. Meetings, concerts, and art presentations, and every other aspect of the school's cultural life took place here. In fact, various groups held their meetings and rehearsals here every day. The grand piano on the stage was used for accompaniment. This is a standard setup for every school in Pripyat. Mathematics was the foundation upon which the Soviet Union's technical development was built. As early as primary school, the brightest pupils, under the vigilant eye of their teachers, advanced their skills in science. The best of them attended secondary schools and later went on to renowned universities to become scientists or engineers. But none of this stopped the Soviet Union from building a malfunctioning nuclear reactor. The faulty design they used was intended for the production of weapons of mass destruction, not for civilian applications, by the way.
School number 3 is one of 5 secondary schools in Pripyat, located on Sportivnaya Street next to the indoor swimming pool.
The school had modern amenities such as music and sports facilities. Although abandoned, the building remains in relatively good condition. It sustained less water damage than other schools in the city. The wooden window frames are still in place, but the cast iron radiators are gone. With its central location and variety of spaces, this school is a fascinating place to visit and a reminder of the hundreds of children who once attended it. It's notable for its collection of gas masks, which have since been scattered on the floor by looters scavenging silver from the filters. The Soviet-made child-sized masks were meant to protect against nuclear, biological, and chemical NBC attacks and were kept on site during the Cold War. It was very modern by Soviet standards of the time. The building was supposedly designed by Kiev Scientific Research Institute of Electrotechnical Physics, like many other schools in the Soviet Union. According to the historical records, the classes were not immediately canceled when the news broke. The children received some iodine pills and were allowed to go home a little early. That was it. These gigantic structures are the cooling towers for reactors 5 and 6 at the Chernobyl MPP. They were built as part of a planned expansion of the facility. Construction of these reactors began in the early 1980s, but was halted following the explosion and subsequent disaster at Reactor 4 in 1986. Cooling towers are commonly used in thermal and nuclear power plants to cool large amounts of water using atmospheric airflow. Water used to reduce heat generated by the nuclear reaction must be cooled to prevent the fuel from overheating and causing a meltdown. Coolant water is pumped through the reactor to a heat exchanger, where the heat is transferred to a separate water circuit flowing to the cooling tower. The hot water is sprayed into the tower and exposed to the air, which cools the water through evaporation. Cooled water is then reused in the heat exchanger, repeating the process, while warm air from the cooling tower is released into the atmosphere. The towers are 150 meters tall and 126 meters in diameter. They're made of reinforced concrete. Unit 5 and its tower were still under construction in 1986 when the disaster occurred, halting all work. Priorities later shifted to constructing the shelter for the destroyed Unit 4, and the new reactors and towers were abandoned. Nowadays, the Chernobyl towers and their artificial islands surrounded by a channel are a popular tourist attraction. On the 30th anniversary of the disaster, an Australian artist painted a mural inside the 110-meter tower, using a 1986 photograph by photojournalist Igor Kostin. Soviet authorities attempted to cover up the extent of the Chernobyl disaster. The Soviet government downplayed the severity of the incident and initially reported only 2 deaths and a few more injured. They also tried to keep the details of the incident secret, with only limited information released to the public. No, the international community soon realized the gravity of the situation as radioactive particles were detected in other countries. This led to increased international pressure to release information. Further information was only made public after increased radiation levels were detected in Sweden, which prompted the Swedish government to alert other European countries. Thus, the Soviet government was forced to acknowledge the incident and its disastrous consequences. Despite the risks, many people in the region, including plant workers, firefighters, liquidators, and doctors, chose to speak out. They revealed the severity of the disaster and the inadequate response of Soviet authorities. This helped spark greater international attention and support, which ultimately led to a more effective response and better aid. Train cars like this one were used to transport irradiated meat after the disaster. During the liquidation of the Chernobyl site, all livestock and wild animals within the exclusion zone were culled to prevent the spread of radioactive meat. When irradiated meat appeared in Moscow stores, the Soviet health minister raised the alarm and halted sales of meat from the exclusion zone. However, the Moscow party bosses ensured their own supply was safe to eat. In the Soviet Union of 1986, meat was still not accessible or affordable for common folk. Beef was especially scarce. The idea of throwing away thousands of tons of expensive food was something party bosses disliked. A protocol was developed to cleanse the meat of radioactivity to make it edible. Processing plants were instructed to soak the meat in chemically treated water, then check radioactivity levels. It didn't help that the plants had to expedite the process due to the huge surplus of meat. This resulted in inaccurate assessments of radioactivity and the mixing of safe and highly irradiated meat, In 1987, over 300 tons of frozen meat was shipped to the Georgian Socialist Republic, but was rejected after being tested by a dosimetrist. The meat was then loaded on a train and caused fear and panic wherever it traveled. The local authorities in Ovruch asked for the meat to be buried, but their request was rejected. The train was then sent to the Ukrainian village of Polotsk, pasted with warning signs and locked up. The radioactive meat remained there until the generator for the refrigeration failed, and the local electricians refused to repair it.
The issue was brought to the public's attention by reporters who took photos of the radioactive train.
KGB agents eventually buried the meat in South Belarus in a concrete-lined pit. The Chernobyl NPP shelter structure, also known as the sarcophagus, is a large concrete and steel dome that covers the damaged Reactor 4 building. The sarcophagus was built to contain radioactive materials following the 1986 disaster and to protect the environment from further contamination. However, due to deterioration, a new structure called the New Safe Confinement was built and completed in 2016. The sarcophagus contained 200 tons of radioactive corium, 30 tons of dangerously contaminated dust, and 16 tons of uranium and plutonium. The Russian name for the structure, Obyekt Ukryte, means covering. The design of the original sarcophagus started on May 20, 1986. Construction took 206 days and involved 8 stages, including clearing the area and laying concrete around Reactor 4, erecting protective walls covering the turbine hall, and installing a ventilation system. The construction used over 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,300 tons of metal framework. It resulted in the enclosure of 740,000 cubic meters of heavily contaminated debris and soil. The New Safe Confinement, also known as the New Shelter or ORCA, is a structure erected in 2016 at the Chernobyl NPP. It also covers the temporary shelter sarcophagus that was built shortly after the disaster. The main objective of the New Safe Confinement is to protect the reactor from external elements, facilitate its decommission, and keep water from seeping in. It's a major project that forms part of the Shelter Implementation Plan, which is supported by the Chernobyl Shelter Fund. Its goal is to contain the radioactive remains for a minimum of 100 years, and to dismantle the original sarcophagus that was hastily built by the liquidators. The structure was designed and constructed by the French consortium Novaka, along with Vinci Construction Grants Projects and Bouygues Travaux Publics. Funding was sourced from the Chernobyl Shelter Fund, overseen by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. 46 countries and organizations contributed to the fund, including the EBRD itself. The cost of the New Safe Confinement exceeded €2 billion. The reactor meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a catastrophic event that occurred on April 26, 1986. It resulted in the release of significant amounts of radioactive materials into the environment. The meltdown occurred during a safety test when one of the reactors at the plant overheated and the fuel rods in the reactor core ruptured. This ignited a fire that released large amounts of radioactive materials into the atmosphere. The explosion and subsequent fire destroyed the reactor and the roof of the building. It sent a plume of radioactive smoke and dust into the air that spread over large parts of Europe. Later on, a special containment structure called a sarcophagus was created to stop the spread of radionuclides. All in all, the disaster caused widespread environmental contamination and led to the evacuation of over 100,000 people from the surrounding area. The explosion and subsequent fire destroyed much of the reactor and the roof of the building. However, remnants of the reactor were eventually encased in a massive concrete structure known as the sarcophagus. It was built to contain the remaining radioactive materials and prevent further spread of contamination. The sarcophagus was built over the course of several months. Over 600,000 workers were involved in the effort. In recent years, a new containment structure known as the New Safe Confinement, or ARCA, has been built over the sarcophagus. This new structure was needed to better contain and protect against the spread of radioactive materials. While the reactor itself was severely damaged and is no longer in operation, much of the radioactive material remains at the site. The Chernobyl disaster was caused by a combination of factors, including design flaws in the reactor, operator error, and an inadequate safety culture. However, several Soviet officials were charged with negligence, including Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Several other individuals were also charged, including Shift Supervisor Boris Rogozhin and the head of the power plant, Viktor Bryukhanov. On the night of April 25-26, 1986, prior to a scheduled maintenance shutdown, Soviet technicians conducted a turbine test on Unit 4 of the Chernobyl NPP. They mistakenly disabled the emergency cooling system and other important safety protocols to perform the test. A series of errors caused a buildup of steam, which led to the reactor overheating. At 1:23 a.m., two powerful explosions ruptured the steel and concrete lid and sent a fireball into the sky, releasing a large amount of radioactive material. The situation was made worse by the subsequent outbreak of several fires, including one inside the reactor core that lasted for 10 days. The Chernobyl disaster released a minimum of 100 times more radiation than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.